Well, welcome everyone. I wanted to say a few words before we go into the seminar. Can you all hear me? Is this working okay? Yeah? All right. I wanted to recognize that these are extremely dangerous times for international students, especially. The illegal arrest of our former student, Mahmoud Khalil, for expressing his political views shows how far the presidential administration is willing to go right now. The recent deportation 2 weeks ago of another former Columbia affiliate, Nascimento Blair, who I represented and continue to represent, shows how dangerous these times are. Blair had been released from prison under the first Trump administration, and within days of the second Trump administration, they reversed course, arresting him on February 3rd and deporting him to Jamaica on February 27th. And Blair reported to me really harrowing conditions at the facility in Jena, Louisiana, which haunts me now constantly as I think of Mr. Khalil's situation. I know I'm speaking for many of you, and I know that you're doing your part in the best way that you can to oppose the unprecedented measures that are being imposed. I received some communications from people, mostly outside of our Columbia community, telling me that I should cancel the seminar because of the urgencies of the present political crises, and that we shouldn't be in seminar, but in the streets. And I feel that these times, more than most, call on us to study as well as act. To act, but also to study. We need to reflect on these crises, to reread thinkers who faced similar crises, to discuss proper responses. And I believe that's what we're going to be doing this evening, confronting in part our actions and our thoughts, our critique and our praxis, particularly this evening through Cedric Robinson's discussion of the Black radical tradition, which I really think we need to engage right now with our dear friend, dear colleague, and dear friend of the 1313 series, Cornel West, who we are extraordinarily excited to have with us here. So I think we will carry on and study and actually cherish this opportunity to have this conversation while we still can, right? I think this is a unique space for critique and praxis. So welcome to Marx 1013. In this session of Marx 1313, we finally arrive in a way at the mature political writings of Marx. Of course, first the publication in 1859 of a critique, a contribution to the critique of political economy, and then 8 years later, Capital Volume 1. We've reached what most people think of when they critique Marx, or when they critique Marxism. And in this session, we will be reading and discussing Marx's mature writings through the lens of Cedric Robinson's landmark work, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. And of course, it's a path-breaking book, and it's famous today, I believe, but it almost fell through the cracks. And it would have fallen through the cracks had it not been for Cornel West and the persistence that he showed in his interest in the book and the importance of the book and getting it reviewed so that people would ultimately read it and deal with what is an extraordinary text, a remarkable text, in Professor West's words, right? A towering achievement, okay? So at the time, it was 1988. Professor West was professor of religion and director of Afro-American Studies Program at Princeton University, where he had completed his PhD in philosophy. And he shattered, really, with this book review, what many people now refer to as a kind of a conspiracy of silence that surrounded Robinson's book. And in part, in part, at some point, maybe we'll get to the question of why that conspiracy of silence. I have some hypotheses, but it's important. Now, so Cornel West propelled this book, Black Marxism, into our contemporary debates. And obviously for this and for many other reasons, it's really a privilege and an honor to have Dr. West with us this evening. Of course, Dr. Cornel West is known to you all very well, most recently because of his presidential run in 2024 with the Justice for All Party, and also because he's a colleague of ours across the street at Union Theological Seminary, which is our affiliated School of Divinity, where he's the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice. A former professor, a university professor at Harvard University and professor emeritus at Princeton University. He's written, of course, paradigm-shifting work in over 20 books, including classics like Race Matters and Democracy Matters. And he's also a musician and lover of music and has produced 3 music albums with artists like Prince, Andre 3000, Jill Scott, and others. So, we share many things, many loves of things, mentors as well, which is beautiful, and it's wonderful to have you here. Now, before I turn it over to Cornel West, I just wanted to make a few framing comments. The mature works in a contribution to a critique of political economy and capital really represent just the first, the tip of the iceberg, the first of a long envisaged multi-volume series that Marx intended to write that would go beyond what ultimately was produced with volumes 2 and 3 and the surplus value volume 4 of Capital. It was a multi-volume that was intended to go, in his own words, as he said in the preface to the contribution, I examine the system of bourgeois economy in the following order: capital, landed property, wage labor, the state, foreign trade, world market. And of course, we would really never get that far. What we would get would be mostly those first sections that would become emblematic on commodities and money and on capital. But that suffices to give us this extraordinary reading of Marx's political economy as opposed to the classical political economists and the socialist utopians. Now, Cedric Robinson's book, which we'll be discussing, as you read, right, offers a really hard-hitting critique of that work. And in many ways, and this is something I think we're going to be discussing this evening, it's not I don't read it as an argument for Black Marxism or for Marxism. It's a book arguing, I think, for a Black radical tradition as a different tradition with its influences and resonances in the present. As you know, just in terms of background, Robinson offers this deep criticism of Marx's history. We'll have to talk about the method, which in part in your book review you were suggesting that he was borrowing a method at the same time as he was offering this critique. And of course, in Robinson's book, he pushes the period over several centuries earlier, pushes us back into the medieval and pre-medieval time to demonstrate the importance of race wars in European history and how those race wars, originally wars between these peoples in Europe, right, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Vandals, etc., evolve into slavery and into forms of slavery and slavery of African peoples, and then the slave trade and the influence of that on the development of capitalism. So he offers us, by going back in that way, really a genealogy of capitalism, which, of course, today most people refer to using the terms that he practically coined. I mean, he wasn't the first to use these terms about racial capitalism, a term that had been used before, but that became so important in this work. And of course, as you read, he then treats three authors in particular in the third part of the book, W.E.B. Du Bois and C.L.R. James and Richard Wright. And it's there, I think, that you had the most criticisms of the work, but so we'll get there. I think one of the interesting ways to set up this conversation, and of course, we want to hear from you about the range of issues that in part mark this whole seminar about Marxism and the influence of Marx, how to reread Marx today to make it useful, such useful material. We want to hear about, of course, your readings of W.E.B. Du Bois and C.L.R. James and Richard Wright, which you are the person to give us your thoughts on that. I mean, you're the leading thinker of those thinkers as well. But in part also the question is, how does the idea of Marx, or how do the Marxist traditions relate to the black radical traditions? And there were certain passages in your review that made it, that I felt suggested a greater kinship to Marxism as a remaining force in our thinking about black radicalism. Certain passages where you spoke about Marxism as being indispensable for the struggle, for instance, or where you end the piece by saying, you know, if Marxism and black radicalism are to be vital in the years to come, which shows, I think, a slightly different relationship to Marxism than Robinson himself. And I think is an interesting place probably for us to start framing this conversation. I've probably said too much, but I did want to give some background and some framing before turning it over to you, who we really want to hear from. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, my dear brother. This is my dear brother, but no, absolutely. Absolutely, really indeed. No, I'm just so very blessed to be here, and anytime I get a chance to be in conversation with my dear brother Bernard, I come running. I think it's been 3 times in the last 3 years.
Yes.
We've done the People's Forum with brother Brandon Terry. We're talking about Malcolm X then, I think it may have been, and then last time we were here, we were talking about my essay with 2 of the brilliant young legal theorists. We had rich dialogue then. I just thank each and every one of you for coming out. These are grim times. There's no doubt about it. And part of the challenge is, how do we fortify ourselves? How do we make sure that we have character, integrity, honesty, courage, vision, so we're true to what's been put inside of us, from grandmama to Sheldon Wolden, our mentor, my thesis advisor, towering figure, Stanley Aronowitz. Towering figure, not just my comrade, but my brother, Barbara Ehrenreich, who just had her funeral in Brooklyn just a few months ago. These are they who also faced catastrophic times and were able to muster courage, integrity, honesty, consistency, constancy in order to bear witness in that way. And so I begin on this note. I begin on a very, very personal note. Namely that I come from a great black people and a great black tradition that's been wrestling with forms of catastrophe and being terrorized and traumatized and hated for who we are for 400 years, and somehow we still able to muster the courage to love and hope and to be in solidarity with others. That's why Brother Mahmoud is my brother. Why? Because like so many others, they mustered the courage to stand up, raise their voices, and the very anthem of my black people is lift every voice, it's not lift every echo. We got too many echoes, just extensions of ideological silos or professional managerial silos. And lifting your voice like a jazz woman or a blues man, you got to find your voice. And you find your voice on a moment of humility, because you are not here that long. And that most of human history, Hegel is right, history's been a slaughterhouse, a slaughter bench. Gibbon said it was a human register of crimes and follies. Most of the history of the species is the history of organized greed and weaponized hatred and institutionalized indifference toward the vulnerable, with structures of domination and exploitative modes of production, and civil societies that marginalize people based on whatever criteria. sexual orientation, whatever it is. Human species is highly creative, as Dostoevsky would say, in its deployment of violence. Not just tied to interest, but gratuitous violence, as Dostoevsky points out in Brothers Karamazov. So that's what we're talking about. So the question becomes, then and now, what are the conditions under which we create moments of interruption, moments of disruption, moments that push back the hatred, the greed, the domination, the subjugation, the degradation? And each person has to answer that for themselves. Now here we have two magnificent figures. I mean, Karl Marx is one of the best in the history of the West. By West, I mean capital W, not my last name. He's not good as my mama, but that's a whole different lecture. But he's one of the best. Why? Because he mobilizes all that he has relative to his shaping and molding the traditions that he has access to. The Socratic legacies of Athens and prophetic legacies of Jerusalem and critical legacies of the Enlightenment. Jewish in origin, 6 rabbis in his family on one side, and the other side rabbis from Dutch, you see. But he grows up Protestant, Lutheran, and he becomes secular, atheistic, but he's got that righteous indignation in terms of what are the conditions under which we can create moments of interruption given the long durée of exploitation. Let's see, that's Marx. And I think anytime we talk about a Marx, and we're going to get to my dear brother Cedric, I knew Cedric, so that it's much more personal. I never had a chance to hang out with Carl, you know. I hung out with him for a long time. I wrote a dissertation on him, Ethical Dimensions of Marxist Thought, so that we spent a lot of time together. So he was my comrade and brother, but I never got a chance to give him a hug. He was dead in 1883. But the first thing to note is vocation. So anytime you enter a conversation with these kinds of figures who are so fundamentally committed to freedom, justice, truth-telling, sacrificing, and willing to die for what they say and believe, you're not just spectators. See, this is an I-thou relation, not an I-it. These are not just objects of critical investigation that sound sophisticated in your language about. They're going to affect your life. What kind of human being you're going to be. There's a wonderful letter that the great writer Henry James wrote to the less great writer Robert Louis Stevenson. June the 12th, 1901. He says, "No theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing. No theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing." And you remember right in the text, our dear brother invokes Trotsky, right? Mm-hmm. Remember he says that? Mm-hmm. I think that's about on page 208 in this text.
Okay.
Well, what does Trotsky say? Just to read this.
208?
Yeah, as I recall, I read it a couple of weeks ago. But where's the 208? Because Trotsky says this is his experience of reading Marx that blew his mind. He says, the important thing was to see clearly. I could say of communism and the Marxist tradition above all that it gave me more clarity. We must liberate ourselves from all that prevents us from seeing. So my hope and prayer is when you read Marxism, Marxist theory, whatever theory it is, feminist theory, black radical theory, anti-homophobic theory, that you see something you hadn't seen before that forces you to examine and interrogate yourself so you become more well-equipped to bear witness for whatever vision of justice you have. And the Marxist tradition is, in fact, the most powerful tradition coming out of the modern West that has led toward people to see things they had not seen before. And that's what theory is, seeing. And in seeing, you attempt to first describe it, then you attempt to interpret it, then you attempt to explain it. So you got all three levels. Right? You got description, interpretation, explanation. All not the same, but they're inseparable. And that's what Marx understood. But to go back to Marx's vocation is to go back to his famous letter of November the 10th, 1837, that he wrote to his father. And this is not the letter to the father that Kafka wrote, that his father never received, but full of hatred and fear. This is a letter of deep love that Karl writes to his father. And he gives his whole genealogy. And he starts off what very few people like to talk about with Marx. He says, I want to be a poet. I've written 3 volumes of poetry. Many of them to Jenny von Westphalen, his wife, to be. Why? Because I can't stand the way the world is. There's a tremendous conflict between what is and what ought to be. And the only way I have of wrestling with the unbelievable, nightmarish character of what is to project some kind of ought world, a different world. And I find it in Jenny, and I find it in you, and I find it in my mother, and so forth. Being honest. Then he goes to law school. He says, I've translated the first 2 books of the Appendix. That begins true jurisprudence. Jurisprudence is the true philosophy. And I'm trying to understand what he is. So I go to law school. Not always the best place to go. If you're interested in the complex dynamics of what is at the levels of power, at the levels of status, at the levels of structures of feeling and structures of value, but Marx is in pursuit of that. And he writes 300 pages in addition to the translation. And he goes on and on. We won't go through. But the thing is, vocation. He's got a calling. And a calling is all about the formation of your attention. So you attend to the things that connect to your calling in order to be the force for good before the worms get your body. And any culture has distractions. Any culture has addictions. Any culture has titillations. Any culture has stimulations that can easily get you off of your calling. But Marx says no. He promises his father, I'm going to be true to what I'm telling you. He's born in 1818, it's 1837, so he's just 19 years old. 2 years later, he's already written a dissertation. Difference between Democritean and Epicurean philosophies of nature. But he's on the way to an understanding of the forms of socially induced suffering in his particular historical moment, which is as a Jew by origin, Protestant in shaping, choice a secular atheist, and moving toward a communist Marxist project. And you all have been following that move throughout your wonderful seminars. And the question then becomes, what is his relation to us? And I think it's very important to never forget what the great Adorno says in section 29, adore fruit. He says, the splinter in your eye is the greatest magnifying glass. The splinter in your eye is the greatest magnifying glass. And that comes from the book of Matthew. We won't get into that right now. A Palestinian Jew named Jesus talked about beams and mutes and splinters in eyes. But what they're saying is, even when you attempt to see any theory, any paradigm, any framework, any forms of description, interpretation, and explanation will have limitations, will have blindnesses. So never look for any one theory having a monopoly on truth, capital T. Intellectually humbling, but recognizing that those insights that flow, and then in Marx's case, it's not just insights, it's movements that flow. are something to be taken very seriously if you are concerned about truth and justice. And so in Marx's case, he's going to be continually growing and maturing. You talked about the preface to Critique of Political Economy that's published there in 1859, same year as Origins of Species. He's going to dedicate Capital to Charles Darwin, right? 9 years later, 1867. But Marx is always growing. But he's growing for what? He's growing because he's trying to equip himself to be able to see and point out to others what they do not see, and he understands the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. And if you're not attending to forms of suffering, it's clear that you've got partial truths. You're not able to be consistent and constant in your descriptions, interpretations, and explanations. And Marx would have been the first in many ways to acknowledge that. That's why he studied Asia and come up with his own formulations, some of it stereotypical, some of it interesting. He studied Russia. He even wrote pieces for the New York Tribune, right? Mm-hmm. He was concerned about the New World. Civil War, white labor will never be free as long as black labor is branded. That's what he wrote in the New York Tribune. Even Abe Lincoln read it in the White House and wrote it in his journals. Who is this Karl Marx talking about this from Germany? Why are they concerned about what's going on here? He's an internationalist. He's a humanist. He's a universalist. But he's grounded in his particularity as who he is. And this is what I really meant by method, you see. Now when, for example, let's just take a look at this page 305. Mm-hmm. That when my dear brother Cedric talks about Richard Wright at the very end, the last, where are we here? Yeah, he says about Richard Wright, he says, as an ideology, Richard Wright recognized that Marx didn't transcend its origins. It remained an ideology for the working classes rather than an ideology of the working classes. He said there were more intellectuals who ended up thoroughgoing Marxists than workers themselves. And those intellectuals formed the vanguard parties that brought the ideology to the workers, because they felt the workers could only ascend to trade union consciousness, and they didn't have access to the deeper truths. And the great Georg Lukács talks about this with such insight, and Rosa Luxemburg disagrees and says if the Marxism is not an ideology coming from the workers and of the workers, they will be manipulated by petty bourgeois intellectuals who become leaders in various parties that act as if they are in the vanguard and always on the cutting edge of all the seeing. Fascinating internal discussion within Marxism between Marxist-Leninists, council communists. That's my tradition. Council communists. Councils without Soviets. No, Soviets without Bolsheviks, let me put it that way. Yes, and the Soviets were the councils of workers who didn't need folk from the outside who educated and have the theory and so forth to lead the workers. The workers working it out themselves. The Council Communist movement never really gets off the ground. Apanicoke in Gorder, and in this country, A.J. Musty, Union Theological Graduate Center, graduate. Close to Sinclair Drake, the only party he ever joined, the greatest sociologist in the black intellectual tradition other than Du Bois, you see. But that's a larger discussion. I have many comrades who are Marxist-Leninists. I have many comrades who are Trotskyists. I have many comrades who are wrong about some things and right about a whole lot of other things. And we go to jail together. And we're willing to get shot together. And we're willing to die together. Because I don't believe in unanimity. I don't believe in wholesale agreement. Each context and each conjectural moment is a moment where you come together and attempt to do something with your pen, with your body, with your time, with your energy. Now, Let me say a quick word about Cedric, and then I'll open it up, because I want to let you know the degree to which whatever limitations Marxist theory has in regard to issues of death and dread and disappointment, and issues of not being able to come to terms with being a black man who was hated, viewed as an abomination, a species of pollution. That's what it is to have a black body in a white supremacist civilization. Marxism is not going to provide a whole lot of insight on that. The best insight would be, it's a rationalization for why black and white workers can't get together. Yeah, that's true. It's much more than that. See, when they cutting off the private parts of black men and black women lynching trees for every 2.5 days for 50 years, that's not a strong enough rationalization to understand and describe and interpret and explain what's going on to these precious black people. There's levels of white supremacy, there's levels of what he calls racialism, there's levels of organized hatred coming at us that needs to be wrestled with if you're concerned about truth, if you're concerned about justice, and if you're concerned about beauty. Because when I first encountered Marxism, coming out of the chocolate side of Sacramento, California, the ghetto in Sacramento, California, way off in the corner where they had, we black folk, access to bookmobiles, but not libraries. And in Shiloh Baptist Church, Reverend Willie P. Cook, my pastor, who baptized me out of Brookhaven, Mississippi. The Black Panther Party was right down the street. And I'd go to church on Sundays and work with the Panthers for the rest of the week. And of course, I'd never joined the party because you had to be a secular and atheist, and I'm a Jesus-loving free black man, so I'm going with Jesus and God. So we had wonderful conversations, wonderful comrades, but I'm a revolutionary Christian to the core, and we'll die that way. And so we had deep comradeship. We didn't have ideological unanimity in that regard. And we were reading Marx. And like Trotsky, I started seeing things. I said, my God, this political system, so beholden to corporate elites. Oh my God, it's the history of empires, not just nation states. My God, America is the 68th empire out of 70 empires since the beginning of the species, and every empire comes and goes, and usually as a result of military overreach and corruption of elites and impotence of citizens and no access of citizens to the best of where they come from in their own traditions, and it implodes. I gotta say something about imperialism. I gotta say something about colonialism. I gotta say something about predatory capitalism. With white supremacy at the center. And then here come, not necessarily the sisters in the choir in Shiloh, but here come Bell Hooks. Here come Michelle Wallace. Here come Alice Walker. Here come Toni Morrison. Here comes Zora Neale Hurston. Oh, y'all talking about black folk, and y'all always talking about black men. What about we sisters? Y'all are central. We don't exist without you. How come you're not part of your analysis, not part of your stories, not part of your narratives? Wow, you're absolutely right. And what is that relation to Marxism? Marx is predicated on historical specificity, on historicizing every particular moment of a mode of production, of a civil society, of a song, of a poem. And when you historicize the Marxist tradition itself, you begin to see the best and the worst. When you historicize the Black freedom movement, and you see the patriarchy, and you recognize that's a major, not just a shortcoming, but it's a disempowering move because it doesn't allow the whole community to come together, then it means things are open-ended and incomplete. And that's precisely what Brother Cedric did, so that I can understand when my very dear brother Robin D.J. Kelly, and of course he wrote this magnificent introduction many years later, it was about 2003, something like that? 2003. He says, I can say without a trace of hyperbole that this book changed my life. Now this is one of the most sophisticated historians alive. He's seeing something. because Cedric historicized the Marxist tradition in all of its various forms, streams and strands. Now, someone like Cedric Robinson, he comes out of the chocolate side of Oakland, just right down the street from me. He goes to Berkeley in the late 50s. And the Berkeley in the late 50s was very much like Columbia in the late 50s. Vanilla to the core. National Hockey League to the core. Male to the core. Patriarchal, deeply sexist, homophobic. Shaping of elites, West Coast. Columbia, shaping of elites, East Coast. Nell Payne was there with him, towering figure that she was. They were classmates together at Berkeley. She goes on to become, major towering figure. And he first makes his way to Africa at the Operation Crossroads, which was founded by Union President, Brother James Robinson. We have his picture right there on the wall. I'll see it tonight when I go back to my office after we break bread. And thanks, brother. Have a little cognac and what have you, Yeah. That he said, we got to get these young people to Africa. Something's happening in Africa. And he goes to Africa, and he starts seeing things he hadn't seen in Oakland. My God, these folk in South Africa dealing with apartheid, these folk dealing with colonization, and they're fighting, and they're pushing, and decolonization is actually winning some victories. Here's Martin Luther King Jr. showing up in Ghana. What you in Ghana for? I want to be close to Nkrumah. Nkrumah's going to be an enemy of the U.S. government. Well, so what? He's my brother. I'm in solidarity with him. I'm probably an enemy already. You don't say, Martin. Ask J.F. Gahuba for that. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. His formation is one in which what? He goes to Berkeley, then Stanford, then Stuart Hall, and others in cultural studies in Britain, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Terence Hopkins, Binghamton, world system theory. Let's talk about capitalism as a world system tied to civilizations, not just nation states and civil societies. Let's talk about it over time, going back to early BC, Athens. Let's talk about it in Rome. Let's talk about Mongolia. Let's talk about the Persian Empire. Let's go all the way through, and then to get to the British Empire, not overlooking the Belgians and the Dutch. The Italians had a little empire. They pushed back by the Ethiopians, thank God. Empire talk, rare. And of course, when I was going to school, hardly anybody talked about empire. Not just because America denied it was an empire, but the scholarship was such. It was all about nation states. You talk about modernity, it was about markets, commodification. You talk about nation states, institutions that have a monopoly on the instrumentalities of violence. And they talked about civil society. What kinds of rights do we have, and how broad will the rights be applicable, What are the background conditions? How did it become a nation state? 13 colonies to 48 states. That's imperialism. Indigenous peoples can tell us a story about that kind of imperialism called Manifest Destiny. Meaning what? Meaning that if we're concerned about being decent human beings with integrity, concerned about truth and justice, you have to be open to a variety of traditions that are trying to teach us to see and provide some descriptions, interpretations, and explanations of the suffering. Now, the workplace, and Marx himself says it quite explicitly in the preface to Capital. He says the classic example is England, so I'm focusing on England. My dear brother E.P. Thompson, who I love so dearly, he and Dorothy, his wife, we used to meet all the time at Eric Foner's house with Eric Hofsbarn and others right across the street here. What does he say in The Making of the Working Class, his classic of 1963? He says, well, class is not a thing, it's a relationship, it's a historical phenomenon. What else does he say? I said, I can only talk about England because I'm talking about something that I'm a part of, and I view it as a cultural and social formation tied to a particular mode of production. So when I talk about Ireland, I'll only talk about the Irish in England. I'm not talking about the Irish nation state. He's got a fascinating treatment of the Irish there in that chapter 12, in the chapter called Community. You remember? And he invokes Engels. Engels talks about the two races. Because the Irish were considered another race, vis-a-vis the English. You see? So he's got a sensitivity to it, but then what else does E.P. Thompson say? He says, and I hope the causes we lost in Europe will be won in Asia and Africa. That's E.P. Thompson, 1963. His father, Edwin, was a missionary in Asia, India. His father was a good friend of the great Tagore, won a Nobel Prize in 1912, who was so close to Gandhi, of course, and M.N. Roy, founder of the Communist Party in both Mexico and India. And then Ambedkar, who studied right here in Columbia under John Dewey, the greatest public intellectual to come out of India, and he's a Dalit brother. Some of them call them the untouchables, the unseeables, the unapproachables, but they're Dalits, and wrote the Constitution too. So it's part of this magnificent conversation and network of freedom fighters and wounded healers, really, that's what they are, who I think really justify and warrant our attention. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're here, and I'm just so glad that all of us are here together at this particular moment, because when we look at this particular moment, you begin to see the deeper connections of predatory capitalist processes, monopolies, organized greed, weaponized hatred, politicians deferential to the big techs, deferential to Wall Street, deferential to big military, and willing to demonize and vilify the most vulnerable folk around, precious trans, immigrants, black people, women, gays, lesbians, and then crushing workers, even as so many of those workers, in a significant way, but not in no way majority, are willing to follow a neo-fascist gangster, Trump himself, partly out of deep frustration because the alternative is so weak and milquetoast and is viewed as the very source of why they are going under. And of course, right here in Columbia, they used to say over and over again, fascism is the product of a bankrupt liberalism where people feel as if there's no other alternative. That means the left, weak as pre-Sweden Kool-Aid in terms of getting people to see, in terms of organizational capacity, in terms of being able to get their vision out to others. And then here, someone like myself come, crack vessel that I am, as a black man of a black people, a blues people who from the very beginning of the country start off as an exploited, hated, degraded, enslaved New World African, where I'm going to gain access to any kind of weaponry. How would it be that these hated people are going to teach the world so much about love? That these terrorized people are going to teach the world so much about freedom? And these traumatized people are going to teach the world so much about healing? So they produce the greatest modern tradition, which is black music, of artistic creativity and spiritual fortitude and moral courage, and use that rhythmic freedom as at least something to hold on to, because you can't have no economic, political, institutional freedom in a white supremacist, predatory capitalist context where you're enslaved, and then Jim Crow, which is neo-slavery, and then our present moment, which is Jim Crow Jr., in terms of residential segregation, in terms of mass incarceration, in terms of decrepit schools, in terms of hoods that are rendered completely invisible in the public discourse, and yet the suffering goes on and on and on. Large numbers of whom would never think about voting because they know how corrupt the system has been for a long time. But then you got the black middle class folk, the black bourgeoisie, caught because they got so many cousins still in the hood. But they surviving, looking for some kind of foothold My dear brother Kendall, you give him a hug for me. Because, you know, he come out of Sacramento, too.
Yes, indeed.
He plays the organ in a way I can't conceive of. I love that brother, but he's a wonderful example. How he finds a foothold in a Columbia Law School, coming out of the same tradition of these blues people with these structures of feeling and structures of value that constitute some sense of their humanity and sanity and dignity in a world where it looks as if they have a chance of a snowball in hell of any realization of their social and economic freedom. That's hope at the deepest level, wrestling with despair. That's what Brother Cedric is trying to say in part in this text. He says it much more eloquently than I can, because Cedric was a very special brother, very special brother. And he has a magisterial erudition that very, very few of us will ever have, you see. But he's not trashing the Marxist tradition. He's historicizing the Marxist tradition. And he says over and over again, just like, did I ever read my Richard Wright?
No.
I never got to read it, huh? I'm going to stop now, though. Let me see what let me tell you what he says about Richard Wright. He says, the idea of working classes. However, he says, as a method of social analysis, Richard Wright always found it compelling. He had not abandoned the conception of the relations of production as a basis for the critique of capitalist society, nor the importance of the class relations of production. The critique of capitalism was the beginning of the struggle for liberation for Richard Wright. That's very important. Now, Richard Wright was a member of the Communist Party. He was right here. He gave the great lecture, how Bigger was born, right here, across the street, in 1941, after Native Son was published in 1940. And he published probably the most powerful critique of capitalism and the most powerful analysis of black culture ever written in a book called The 12 Million Black Voices. He's 32 years old. International figure with the Native Son just being published. But it's a text that's been out of print. They bring it back out. It goes back out of print again. And when people talk about Richard Wright, they only want to talk about Native Son and Bigger. And of course, all of his sexism, the killing of Bessie that we've talked about, the black sister, and then the killing of Mary, the white sister in that novel, and what have the rage, the critique that he receives from the person whose letter of recommendation he wrote in order for him to go to Paris, the genius of Harlem named James Baldwin. When Baldwin turns on Richard Wright, Jimmy was wrong. He was wrong. He really was, and he knew he was. And they had a physical fight over that in Paris, you know, when they got together. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't want to get into all this gossip and things, though, but every day I receive a poem from Richard Wright's daughter named Julia Wright. And I won't read it, but she's got some powerful, powerful words. And one of the things she's always mindful of is the degree to which her father gets stereotyped by the two persons who he enabled, James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison. Ralph Ellison was the best man Richard Wright was the best man at Ralph Ellison's wedding. And yet Ralph turns on him so intensely. James Baldwin turns on Richard Wright. How come they can't be like Coltrane and Monk? Pit against each other as colossal saxophonists, they get together, play together, empower each other, enable each other. Because it ain't about the music, it's about the people. Touching their souls and unsettling their minds. That's what is required. So it is, too, when you talk about black radicals vis-a-vis the Marxist tradition. Because I've read some of these critiques, you know. William Robinson and Jeff Goldman and some of these folk coming at Cedric so hard. And I say, I've learned much from William Robinson's essays in Science and Society. I've learned much from Jeff Goodwin's Marxist analysis. But you don't have to attack my brother like that as if somehow he's foreclosing and precluding anybody reading you. He got his own voice. He's not looking at the world through some ism. He don't have no sectarian mentality as if he's got to be part of the in crowd. He's concerned about Jamal and Letitia and Ray Ray and Shaniqua in the hood. That's his priority. And if you provide insights and the Marxist tradition does, then you use it and deploy it. But if all you can do is just attack, then you got to check yourself. And this is true not just between Marxists and black radicals, this is true between black people themselves, between white activists themselves, between Palestinian activists themselves, between Jewish Voices for Peace themselves. How do you empower each other? Because we all gonna end up in the same jail anyway. And this is often what happens in the 1960s and 70s. The same people we were fighting like I don't know what, you know, to just show up and say, dang, I see. We did the right thing. We in the right place in jail. But maybe we got to be more like the jazz musicians at their best. You know, at their best. Jerry Allen, yes. Mary Lou Williams, Farrah, Jasmine Griffin, yes. Lift them up critically but lovingly. And I just use that one example. And so as I enter this dialogue, I just note there's a personal connection to Cedric. I was critical, as you know in the text, because he tries to solicit Richard Wright as a black nationalist. I said, no, he didn't have black nationalist bone in his body. He's like myself. So I'm suspicious of every form of nationalism. I think nationalism is a major form of idolatry of European modernity other than markets and commodification. But I do believe in black people who is not the same as black nationhood. You have a connection to a people owing to their common culture with all of the heterogeneity and diversity, but that doesn't mean you want a nation state. Same is true with Jewish people. Jewish people have been hated and terrorized for 2,500 years. If anybody deserves to be protected in the history of Western history, it's Jewish brothers and sisters. But Jewish peoplehood is not the same as Jewish nationhood. And if Theodore Herzl and others want to argue the only way we have safety is to have a nation state that has its mentalities of violence, then you're going to find yourself in the cycle of being a nation in the modern world, and every nation from Liberia to South Africa, to Guatemala, to the United States, to Germany, more than likely is going to end up demonizing some folk and subjugating them. You have to come to terms with that. So how do you hold on to the righteous concern about the protection of folk who have been terrorized and traumatized? So I'd have a deep connection to black peoplehood. But black nationhood, no. No, if they had a black nation, I would have to be as indicting of that nation as Chomsky is of the Jewish nation state. Because every nation state has those proclivities. And usually the elites who gain access to the powers and mechanisms of domination in those nation states, they use it. And it's not just against Palestinians in the Jewish sense. It's Jewish dissenting voices too. Liberia would be another example. What Negroes did to indigenous peoples in Africa in the name of a new nation state. You see, that's the kind of attitude and sensibility that I bring to this. And I've gone much too long, but let me stop there and open it up for queries, so brothers and questions.
It is always so inspiring to have you with us, Cornel West, and to feel your presence and the depth of your commitment to ideas and practice. It's stunning. And the wealth of knowledge that, I'm just, every time we talk, I'm just floored. I'm just so glad you're here with us. Thank you.
You bless me, brother. You bless me.
I want to make one comment, and then I want to ask you a little bit about W.E.B. Du Bois, because we didn't talk about Du Bois, and I think that and we need to bring him in. But and let me also say, just come on in. There is one seat right here. I don't know if there's any other seats, but you don't have to stand. So there's one at least. I want to make everybody comfortable. So come on. Okay. So one of the things that I did here and here's the, I think this is mostly a comment. I mean, it was a way to help us think about not just Marxism and the black radical tradition, but more generally about critique in a way, a critique in the relationship to praxis. And when you said, you know, no one theory will have the truth. No one theory will have the truth. And also when you speak about the idea that you don't believe in unanimity, right? That ties beautifully, I think, to, and so in a way, I just want to highlight an argument that I think is at the heart of what you're suggesting, which is the method of Marx of historicizing, right? And materializing, historicizing and materializing. Right. I think what you're suggesting is that that was Marx's move, in a way, right? Through the historicization and materialization of theories, practices, ongoing ways of thinking about the world, develop critiques and transformations of the ideas, which was Marx's move, but was Cedric Robinson's move on Marx, in a way, exactly, right? Exactly. And the same move being, okay, we're going to actually historicize Marx and fit him in this longer trajectory, this longer historical trajectory that goes back further to the race wars in Europe, and in the process makes us realize that, wait a minute, there were certain limitations to this critique. But then it gets historicized, and then the further move is kind of and then there's, actually it turns out that it becomes patriarchal, it becomes male-dominated in a way. And then we have that critique, which then takes us in. And so it's not just that no one theory will have truth. It's that as we kind of develop what seem to be truthful and accurate ways of thinking, we grow, we develop better ones, but we have to be cognizant of the shortcomings that there will be in there. And you never get to a final resting space. Right. You get to a constant moment of critique, but then critique of the critique in a way that keeps on pushing you forward. Absolutely. Right? You do get to places that seem appropriate for a particular point in time. You do get to places where the critique seems as if it's got traction and is doing good work, such as, for instance, Marx in the 19th century with kind of an industrial working class and contexts like that, which it has its shortcomings. So, that's the Cedric's critique of E.P. Thompson, right? It didn't look at the relations between the Irish peoples and the English, and as a result, it was blind to these dynamics. So we build on it, and so always we're engaging in forms of critical thinking, always being critical of our own critical thinking, to then kind of continue to face the world in a proper way. And one question, and this is more a comment, not really a question, because I do want to get to W.E. Du Bois, but we can come back to it later. Becomes, what are the, we need thought for this moment, but we also need to figure out what are our shortcomings, right? With our ways of thinking, with our critical ways of thinking, our own critical ways of thinking in this moment. What are our shortcomings, right? To push us further. But I really appreciate, and I just wanted to, in a way, highlight the dynamic, cyclical way in which you're imagining this based on the reading of Marx and the reading of Cedric Robinson, and how to think about Cedric Robinson's reading of Marx and what that tells us about this cyclical kind of critique, ongoing cyclical critique, right? Okay. All right. So that was good. But I do want to ask you to share with us some thoughts about W.E. Du Bois. We can't miss this opportunity with you here. One of the greatest thinkers on W.E. Du Bois. Now, there's a way in which it seems to me that having listened to you now, that your reading, your interpretation, your reading of W.E. Du Bois is the one that seems most convincing to me right now. We read we read Black Reconstruction in America earlier, and we've read it before, actually, in the context of the Abolition Democracy 1313 extensively. And we had, in part, maybe in one of our earlier readings, a very Marxist reading, or a reading of W.E.B. Du Bois, which was really infused with Marx, which there's no, I mean, you know, when you look at the text, when you look at the whole text, I mean, the way it's structured, the counter-revolution of property, the general strike, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the way it's kind of taken up again. I mean, in all of the work, right? You know, this footnote, right? I think it's on page 381 that we were reading. Opportunity to study inductively the Marxian theory of the state. He wanted to call the chapter "The Dictatorship of the Black Proletariat in South Carolina," right? But then he moved away from that. But it's so infused with that direct conversation with Marx. But as you're suggesting, and as you were putting in conversation Marx and Cedric Robinson, you really do get a sense that maybe this is the prime illustration of how you can do that. That's a feeling I'm getting. Now, of course, Robinson wanted to pull it more towards the Black radical tradition, or at least the later Du Bois. And some people want to pull the Du Bois more towards Marx, but there's a way in which actually, I don't know. So I want you to talk more about your reading of Du Bois, because I actually think that it fits perfectly as one of these critical cycles where, you know, Cedric Robinson actually adds a lot to our thinking and to our reading of Marx. I mean, of Du Bois. Freudian slip. Right. Okay. All right. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Absolutely. No, I think the first thing to always keep in mind, and when you're reading these towering figures who have a deep, deep love for Black people, that they begin with a moment of desperation. And Du Bois is desperate his whole life. He cannot find a way of seeing and analyzing in order to change a situation that he knows to be barbaric. So that's why you're going to have 5 or 6 different ideological shifts in his life. He dies at 95, right? So he begins, he's an elitist, he's liberal, he's Harvard trained. Should he work with Booker T? Well, they're friends privately, but he goes public in his critique when Walter Trotter is attacked. Then the next thing you know, he's a socialist, and the Socialist Party, Eugene Debs, don't want to have a special program to deal with racism, so he breaks. Then he votes for Woodrow Wilson. Then he becomes an agent of U.S. imperialism. He works for the State Department. He cooperates for the deportation of Marcus Garvey. That's Du Bois, too. And you read Souls of Black Folk in 1903, then you read the Souls of White Folk in 1920, 2 qualitatively different personas, tones across the board. Souls of Black Folk would have been an NAACP manifesto. Souls of White Folk, Malcolm X is in him. That rage. America, you ain't nothing but a trail of human hatred institutionalized over time, treating Black people as if they, wow, that sounds like Frederick Douglass of July 5th, 1852, doesn't it? Your celebration is a sham, your national greatness is a vainglory. Then Du Bois, in the same book, Dust of Dawn. Let's talk about the beauty of the sky. Let's talk about the overlap of the ocean, almost Freudian in his concern about oceanic feelings of the continuities between human beings and the rest of the cosmos. Ooh, wow. Du Bois, well, I'm a complex, complicated brother. Then the Marxism kicks in. He's kicked out of the NAACP that he co-founded with the office right there, right down the street here. But he's the only black member of the staff. National Association of Colored People. White liberal, money behind it. How free can you ever be if your money flow is circumscribed? It's hard to follow Jesus if you're on Pontius Pilate's payroll. I'm not saying that as a Christian, I'm just a sociological observation. I am a Christian, but I'm just making that observation, you see. It's tough. That's Du Bois. But he leaves. Remember the Communist Party. I'll never come back to this country again. Don't allow one molecule of my body to be buried here. They had me in handcuffs in 1951 to sending me to jail. I'm 83 years old because I'm a member of the Peace Information Center calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons. My God, Du Bois. Can't get a place in White Side of Brooklyn. If it wasn't for the great Arthur Miller, you know, the great death of salesman and all my sons. He was my dear brother. You spend weekends with him in Roxbury, Connecticut every summer. He buys the house and then hands the keys to Du Bois. So they think that it's a white person who owns the house. That's how he and Shirley stayed on 30 Grace Place in Brooklyn. Those kinds of deep solidarity moves in that regard. Now, I'm sure Du Bois probably had to follow through on some installment plan and what have you, so I'm not saying that Brother Arthur just gave it to him, but it was a public face in that sense. So Du Bois is up and down. The only constant is his deep commitment to trying to see the truth and to pursuing justice. And he has deeper conceptions of justice. So he doesn't read Marx systematically until he's in his 60s. But that's like finally listening to Aretha when you're 55 and she been out for 40 years. Hey, what clubs you been hanging out in? But it showed a certain kind of parochialism and provincialism even for a genius and a giant like him. And so I was critical because when he said Du Bois was tied to black nationalists, when he's responsible for the most towering black nationalist leader in the history of America that generated the largest mass movement in the history of the country, our dear brother Marcus Messiah Garvey from Jamaica. You working with the State Department for him? Oh, no. He believed in self-segregation. That's what he was talking about in the text that he viewed him as a black nationalist. He said, segregation's here to stay. Looks like we got to work within our segregated spaces. And so it's voluntary self-segregation. That's not black nationalism. And so I talked to Brother Cedric about this. And when I was blessed, you see, to actually take courses from Shirley, who was Du Bois's second wife. She taught at Harvard, 1970, 71. And I was blessed to be there under the great Hugh Guinier, who was the founding chairman of Afro-American Studies. Now, she was always a Marxist and a communist. You see, she put pressure on Du Bois, in the same way Coretta Scott King put pressure on Martin to come out against the war. She came out against the war 2 years before he did. She and Stokely putting pressure on Martin. Shirley putting pressure on Du Bois. Because Du Bois is much older, but he also had his own, you can imagine, certain sedimentations and presuppositions in terms of how far he should go and so forth. And it's still a very loose kind of Marxism in 1935 in Black Reconstruction. And our dear brother Eric Foner, who's really written a magisterial book on Reconstruction, building on Du Bois quite explicitly, makes that clear. So Du Bois is very, very complicated. He really is. And he lives so long, it's hard to keep track of him. But one of the saddest moments in the history of black letters was Du Bois's speech he gave from China. He's 91 years old. I wish people get a chance to read that. He says, I have no authority, I have no status. He says, I have no money, I have no wealth, and I'm nothing but a Nigger in my country, but I have my soul, and I try to speak the truth, and I want to oppress people to know all around the world, in Africa and Asia and others, that we must continue, we must forever be determined. And you say, God, Du Bois, I only got a few years to live after that kind of struggle. I was talking about my dear sister's father, 99 years old, right? And all the sacrifice and struggle, and he look around and see all of this fascism escalating, thinking, dang, did I struggle in vain? No, we're just defeated at the moment. Right defeated momentarily is always greater than the gangsters and evil triumphant at the moment, because this too shall pass. Don't confuse this contingent moment with somehow thinking that there will not be clouds of witnesses with resistance, remembrance, reverence for something bigger than their egos, and willing to live and die and be examples for those who come after. And I speak again from a people who, after 244 years of barbaric slavery, still never gave up at their best. So this fascism ain't new in that sense. It's different, it's distinctive, but it's not new in terms of the overarching thing. And I think even in Marx's case, you know, as a poet, you know what Percy Shelley meant to him. Oh, the mask of anarchy, avarice and murder and fraud personified in that poem. Prometheus Unbound, Marx's letters talking about what Shelley meant to him, what Schiller meant to him in those letters of aesthetic education. You see, that there was a poetic level of images, of lived enactments of hope in overwhelmingly catastrophic times that are always at work, even in his scientific work. As he moves toward a more scientific sensibility, what you all read in the Grundrisse and so forth, and in the Critique of Political Economy, but that poetic and the analytic, and then the strategic. What we gonna do? How we gonna organize? How we gonna mobilize? What kind of tactics will we use? All three of those levels simultaneously enacted, both in Marx and as well in Cedric. I mean, Cedric's experience in Africa is very, very important. Cedric's experience when he went to, in 1971 to 73, he spent 2 years in Ann Arbor, but he worked with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. The League of Revolutionary Black Workers with General Baker and Brother Ken, and Daryl just died, Daryl, my dear brother Daryl, who was one of the founders of the Communist Labor Party and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Daryl Mitchell, that's his name. That they were actually, in some ways, more revolutionary than the Black Panther Party, because they were right at the workplace organizing UAW folk, pulling folk from Local 65 into the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. I was just with Horace Sheffield III, whose father was the first black foreman there at the UAW, and he fighting with the League because the League was pulling his people. Because he's a member of UAW, and UAW was already too liberal and too accommodating, and had the League of Revolutionary Black Workers pulling them away. Well, see, that's Cedric's people. He was with them. That's in the 70s. Then he goes to the Birmingham and Binghamton and so forth. And of course, his work out in Santa Barbara, it may look like he's close to the beach, but this brother is involved in movements all around the world in Santa Barbara. He brought another towering figure there, my dear brother, the great Gerald Horne. He brought Gerald Horne right there to University of California, Santa Barbara. And you all know Gerald Horne's work. He's trained here too, wasn't he? At the law school. Is it? I think he was trained at law school. Because he's Princeton, Columbia, he got so many Ivy League degrees. Oh, he's unbelievable, though. He's still going very strong at the University of Houston, I think it is. I think he's in Texas, University of Houston. But I say that because, again, when you think of somebody like Cedric or like Carl, and we can say the same thing, of course, about so many other peoples, we want to be able to keep track of all of these different dimensions of their lives, their callings, their relations of the traditions and then their attempt to hold on to revolutionary spirits. And one of the things that Cedric used to always say after I give him a hug, he used to say, the socialist spirit will endure. It will not die. I said, you don't have to be no Marxist to say that. You saying that because you believe it. It ain't a question of what group you're a part of. That's Cedric Robinson. And that's how he went out 9 years ago, you see. And of course, he wrote many other texts that we had a chance in a seminar. We would talk about his dissertation. We would talk about his book on anthropology of Marxism. We would talk about his work on music. He had one of the most popular radio stations in Southern California tied to the history of black music. He was a jazz man to the core. Jazz man to the core. Very much so. A lot of people used to hit him hard on the marriage question because he married a vanilla sister. She is a towering figure, intellectual, freedom fighter, Sister Elizabeth. And they said, well, you a black nationalist, you a Pan-Africanist, how come you hanging out with this vanilla sister? I'm a free man. I don't ask for your permission as to who I love. Now, if you want some consultation, meet me on around the corner. We can have longer reflections. And then that precious daughter, who's still strong as ever. I won't mention names because we got so many death threats out here. I don't want to add too many other names of people who are alive, especially with somebody like myself. I could be shot any minute.
We'll jump in front.
I should have told y'all that before we all came in here. No, absolutely.
All right. So I do want to open it up, and I've got I actually have a first question coming in from a dear friend. But I did want to make one comment about one thing you said.
Sure.
Which is, you were talking about more radical than the Black Panther.
The League of Revolutionary Black Workers?
Yeah, but I do want to say what was remarkable, in my opinion, about the Black Panthers, about Huey Newton, was the way in which his base, I think, his constituency was what Marx would have considered the lumpen proletariat.
Yes, that's right.
Right. His constituency was the folks who were coming out of prison, folks going into prison, and in a way that was a very radical move on his part, to really think of who is going to be the engine of history, and to find it in a class, in a subclass that had historically been disregarded and specifically critiqued by Marx.
That's right.
But that would become so massive in our age of mass incarceration, right? So that's something. All right,
so
go ahead.
See, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers were at the plant, so they could shut some things down. You see, and this is again one of the insights of the Marxist tradition. You see, that if we had a organized working class, let's say the way South Korea does. See, South Korea has a trade union movement so powerful that they can shut the country down tomorrow. Our trade union movement, hard-working folk, but 9–10%, 75% of them liberal, centrist, progressive Democratic Party affiliates, you see. So when the League of Revolutionary Workers, they could shut certain plants down in Detroit. Now you see, that's much more of a threat to the ruling class in Detroit than even what Huey and them were doing, which is trying to organize these precious brothers and sisters in the lumpen proletariat, but their relation to the mode of production was such that the threat that they had was chaos-producing rebellion. That was the threat. But usually that's spontaneous. That's not organized. So there is something about the centrality of the class struggle that should never be overlooked. There's no way under God's heaven Trump and Musk and these other folk could be doing what they're doing if they felt there was an organized working class that could shut America down tomorrow morning. They wouldn't do it. They can't get away with it. But that's part of what the Marxist challenge has always been. That's what's powerful about it. And that's a little different than Huey and them, see. Because Huey had some working class brothers in there, but it was primarily proletariat brothers and sisters. And then you had some, you had some middle class folk who joined later on. But is that a point fair?
That was that's fair. That's fair. But I did want I want to give the first question to a dear colleague, Tom Durkin, in Chicago, an Irish brother from the south side of Chicago, 79th Street, who's very dear to my heart. We've litigated a lot of cases together, from Guantanamo to we sued Trump the first time on the Muslim ban. So we've been in the trenches a lot together. He is simply fascinated by the relationship between these readings of Marx and the early Christians. Okay, and so I thought you'd be a perfect person to ask this question. Right now it's 6 pages long, so he's actually developing this into more of an article. But the point is, reading these materials took me back to Bentley Hart and his relatively recent translation of the New Testament, his introductory description of the first Christians as radicals, and that, dare say, there were, even in the strictest technical sense, communists, as the book of Acts quite explicitly states. To be followers of the way, as the early Christians called their project, was to renounce every claim to private property, to commit to communal ownership of everything, says Hart, citing none other than Acts 4:32. So I did want to get your sense on that, and yeah, I want to get your reaction to that. I know Tom wants your reaction to that, but then also, and then how does that relate then to? Can we think about the way in which it might relate to the black radical tradition as well? Okay.
And I do want to note, you got some good news on your case, though, brother.
Yes.
You want to just tell them right quick?
Yeah. No. Just 1 hour before we came down here, got a good ruling from a federal judge it's on a case that I filed a year ago challenging nitrogen hypoxia as a method of execution in Alabama, and it's actually been a good day. Louisiana, a federal judge in Louisiana, preliminarily enjoined the use of nitrogen asphyxiation in Louisiana. But in my case, the judge allowed us to proceed and go forward. So that was great news. We've been waiting for a decision on that. And there's a motion to dismiss, and so
absolutely.
We're
looking for every sign of hope we can, and all the effort you put in. But no, just quickly though, that when it comes to the history of Christianity, which is a kind of rich footnote to prophetic Judaism. You see, there is no Jesus without prophetic Judaism. He's a rabbi, you see. And he has to decide how he's going to generate some possibilities given what has been poured into him. So even as his most powerful moments in his life, he's invoking Hebrew scripture from Isaiah and so forth and so on. That's what's in it. His vocation. My aim is to liberate the poor. That's Hesed to orphan, widow, motherless, fatherless, enslaved people, and so forth. So it's very important to understand those deep prophetic Judaic soil from which Christianity comes. Paul himself, of course, a Roman citizen, but also a Jewish brother. But he has different understandings theologically of what Jesus is all about. So the early Christians are very, very different than any of the Marxists because there's a thick pessimism about the world in the early Christians that's alien to Marx. Marx is a child of the European Enlightenment, of Kant's Enlightenment. What is enlightenment? Dare to know, man's self-incurred tutelage, man's self-imposed immaturity. How do you break from that? With your own agency. Wholesale, human agency all the way down. Well, Marx, what about grace? Well, I read Schiller's wonderful essay on grace and dignity, and I understand that grace is really that kind of inexplicable thing that's inseparable from love under the influence of freedom. Okay. Still Enlightenment sensibility. For these early Christians, all you can do is bear witness to a love that makes no sense in the eyes of the world, tied to a grace whose source is greater than you. So when they refuse to worship the Roman gods, they're killed as atheists, right? Mm-hmm. Because they refuse to acknowledge the gods of Rome, so they're atheists. Mm-hmm. And for them, it's just a matter of bearing witness to the stories that they have. It's not a matter of overthrowing and revolutionizing the Roman Empire. If Marx were around and he had the First International and he saw these Christians over here, he said, dang, I like this fire y'all got. Because you're willing to live and die for something. I identify with that. But let's overthrow the Roman Empire. We need to organize. And they would look at him like, you must be from the 19th century Europe. We got tragic sensibilities. That's what our cross is about. And we got some crazy ideas about resurrection that y'all not going to entertain. Very different worlds. But they're elective affinities and continuities. So you end up with many revolutionary Christians like the Levelers and the Diggers, Martin King, Fannie Lou Hamer, Rabbi Heschel and Judaic traditions, and so forth and so on. The love overflowing of a Baal Shem Tov, unbelievable joy and flowing, and the very sign of who you are is how much you love, and all you do is love Yahweh and people, and the rest is commentary. See, Marx could probably say, that's a nice spirit there, because he's on fire. But how do you translate that to analysis of what you're up against, dealing with structures, institutions, organizations, and so forth? So there's some very there's distances between the two. I'm talking to the Irish brother. There's distances between the two. And at the same time, there is some significant overlap. And of course, I mean, my God, you got the Irish Catholic socialists. That's a rich tradition. Anti-imperialism. 800 years of British imperialism coming at our precious Irish brothers and sisters. No, absolutely.
All right, good. Let me pass the mic. Folks who got some questions. We're going to start with Jack Ruiz right here.
How's it going, Brother West?
How you doing, my brother? Good to see you. Good to see you, man.
I got two questions, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Let me just start with the first question. One thing in the readings and in kind of like Marxist tradition a little bit I've been seeing is that they say that kind of the revolution start with like the bourgeoisie class because they have like the space in order to think about these ideas, and then they get to organize the working class. But like part of me feels like a certain like trouble in my spirit when I kind of think about that, because it sucks that at the end of the day, like it's the bourgeoisie class that's whose entire permission in order to do this is based on their privilege, and then coming to the working class and being like, yo, like here's an idea, and kind of imputing it onto them a little bit. So like my question kind of revolves around how do you like work with that dissonance a little bit? Is it maybe just is it the idea beyond us and not owned by just one class, or is there a way of like synergy and working amongst each other that just transcends that?
Oh, it's a wonderful question. I know you got another one. Let's answer that right quick.
Yeah,
brother. One to keep in mind now that Richard Wright dropped out in 9th grade, right? And he got more to say than a whole lot of folk with 2 PhDs. Because at least 2 colleges went through him, even though he didn't go to a college. Curtis Mayfield dropped out of 8th grade. Look at that genius flowing out of him. We got folk coming out of Juilliard, Manhattan School of Music. Can't come close to Curtis. Of course, he got so many songs, he don't know what to do. We just lost the great Iceman, didn't we? Jerry Butler wrote Precious Love when he was 16. Curtis wrote I'm So Proud when he's 15. Gypsy Woman, he's 14. Everyday people, working people, lumber proletariat. Oh, Lord, you got some geniuses and talents out of there like I don't know what. But like any other class, you got mediocrity too. I mean, the history of Columbia, in part, is a kind of white male mediocrity to the degree to which they didn't allow the women in, they didn't allow other folk in. But then you still got some magnificent folk coming through Columbia. From the Trillies to the Zaids to, we can go on and on and on, right? So it's always a human thing. Duke Ellington was middle class, but he had to pay homage to a brother who was at 8 years old in the orphan. His name was Louis Armstrong. Duke Ellington's father worked in the White House. And Duke, when he would see Louis, he had to bow down. He listened to their music together. So much respect, so much love. Why? Because Duke earned his status among this great art form produced in Mississippi Delta, no degrees, no middle class folk for the most part. But then when the middle class folk hear it, they say, we're interested in excellence and dignity too. Let me get in on this. Let me get in on this, you see. But in this text, Richard Wright, he's like James Cone. Gut, bucket, Jim Crow, South Mississippi for Richard Wright, Arkansas for James Cone. Never forgot where they come from, ever. But they end up with some black middle class friends, because those black middle class friends earned their respect. And that's something that's always possible, always possible. Does that try to get at your question?
Help me, just a second question, a real quick follow-up. It's just a question more about like praxis and theory, you know, with everything happening with Mahmoud and just thinking about this idea of the executive, you know, the president. It's kind of a question about like, you know, as we're deconstructing and constructing in the future, like how do we kind of like think about the idea of like executive power, specifically the executive president, because like, and like, it's kind of based on your experience. How did you navigate that, you know, like, do you have this position that creates so much violence that's kind of based on just like honestly violence against like putting people out, executing the law, military? Like when you were kind of running for like a president and stuff like that, how did you like think about that? The idea of like, it's really, that position is built on power accumulation. And as we think about accumulation and like spreading out the power, how did you like vibe with that and like try to like solve like the contradictions and tensions with that?
Oh, you mean when I was actually running for president?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah. No, because running for president is just a small version of running for truth and justice, which I've been trying to do all my life. So it was just a matter of being honest. I want to head the empire in order to dismantle it. So I would live about one day, but that's what I plan to do, and I told them, you see, we're going to eliminate poverty within a month. Just like dismantling, there's ways of dismantling for poor people. Executive privilege actually comes out of the rights of kings. When you look at the history, legally, constitutionally, and so forth, and Wolin's talked about this, the executive, it's in John Locke's second treatise too, you see, that there's still something like pardon and what have you that's beyond the scope of any of the separation of powers resting in the lap of the president. Now, that's kingly. That's kingly. Now, if you had a king who read Marx and Robinson closely, or if you had Catherine the Great, who had read radicals of her day, and she has tremendous scope and power and arbitrary power, and she uses it on behalf of poor and working people, you'd have a different kind of history. They wouldn't last that long. They're revolts from the inside. You'd probably be poisoned, and you got to be very mindful of who you choose for your court jesters and fools, because you had special relations with them, just like in Shakespeare's plays, right? Those fools have very direct access. You got to trust them. But it's used against poor and working people. And of course, now it's just out of control in ways that it's almost unprecedented in the history of this empire. But
Thank you, brother.
Thank you for both.
Thank you, Brother West.
Thanks, Jack.
Definitely.
Hope? Hope?
Thank you. My name is Hope. Thank you, Dr. West, for such a wonderful talk. I'd like to bring us back to kind of what you started with when you remarked, and maybe you touched on a little bit with the Christian answer, when you remarked upon how the Marxist tradition doesn't really have the resources to address the existential questions like death.
Oh, right.
And I'd like to ask your help about this, because I've been organizing for a while. Like, I put my life on the line at various times, my safety, my security, my job. Certainly not as much, as you have, as many people in this room have. But lately, as a trans person, I have been feeling that death is not just something that I choose to risk, but something that I now live in the shadow of.
Yes,
and this has been challenging rather than what I anticipated, which was strengthening my resolve to organize. It's been making me feel Like maybe I should care more about my immediate sphere of love and community. Maybe I should care more about my family, the things that bring me pleasure. And so I would really love to hear from your wisdom about not just like what it means to risk that you might get hurt or harmed, but to live in, just the best way to put it for me is the shadow of death, and still choose to envision a world maybe you won't get to see, you know what I mean? You might like lose everything that you get as a human being in this one shot at life for the sake of. So I'd really love your help with that question.
Oh, that's a heavy one. You know that. That's a heavy, heavy, heavy one. Indeed, indeed. And again, it's like falling in love. You got to make that choice. I mean, for someone like myself, I can just give personal testimony, you know, that, see, my mother or my father's not alive. You see. So that's a BCAD in your life. It's like a major line in your life, you see. That all the things that I was doing, I always had to put a major weight on its impact on them, given all that they gave to me. It didn't mean that they had a leash around my neck or anything, but it was consideration. Same is true with my wife, same is true with my kids and grandkids and so forth. But with mom and dad, it was always a special kind of thing. That's one reason why I wear black suits. After dad died, I just put on my cemetery clothes every day and I'm coffin ready, you see, because it had that kind of impact on me. What did Marx do when Jenny died? Does anybody remember what she did? What he did? That brother put her picture in his back pocket and went walking in the Alps in the snow, and Ingalls had to go get his brother. That's deep love. That's deep trouble. Everybody responds in a different way. Everybody's who they are, not somebody else. Once Jenny was gone, Marx said, hey, that's it. What about the British Museum? You got 21 notebooks. You got 3 volumes. What about the 4th volume? Kowski's went hunting. Oh, Jenny's gone, man. Here's some whiskey. It ain't working, Fred. See what I mean? Everybody got to deal with death, dread, despair, disappointment, disenchantment, despondency, and despair. That's what it is to be human. No doubt about that. And we have to have some structures of values and stories and feelings in order to do it. There's secular sources. Secular sources can be very rich. Religious sources and so forth and so on. Me and Brother Stanley used to talk about this all the time. Stanley, secular to the core. Jewish brother from Brooklyn, genius from Brooklyn. And we talk about that. Oh, I don't want to talk about that right now. Let's just listen to some Beethoven. But he listened to the Beethoven dealing with death. Opus 131. Or Mahler. Then he start crying. I give him a hug. One of those real deep black Baptist, crypto-Marxist, thoroughly socialist hugs. Then he give me one of his hugs back. So I'd say to you that you think through with all of these different weights of the factors with those who love you. And just know that many of us are in solidarity with you indeed. Do not forget that. Don't forget that though, brother. Definitely.
Thank you, Hope. Thank you, Cornell, for that. I've got a dear friend and colleague, and then I'll get you, David.
Hello, Dr. West. Hi, Bernard. How you doing?
How you doing there, brother? Good to see you.
My name is Delia Vasquez, faculty at NYU. And thinking about this Black Studies question that always resonates, that you gestured towards, that can't be reduced to divide and conquer. Why white racism takes the extreme, tortuous form that it takes. That seemingly some of the Marxists haven't been able to grapple with to the fullest extent. I can't help but think of the first chapter in Robinson's Black Marxism that talks about what he calls a process of Europe colonizing herself, where there was already racism, there was already slavery present there. So, how might we think about that as like a origin story before Europeans went out and colonized the rest of the world, this deep colonial traumatized status, and what that might mean for the population there when they then set out beyond their borders. Huey Newton actually has some unpublished writing thinking about this specifically. You mentioned the Black Panther Party. He argues that before England colonized African people, indigenous people, the English capitalists colonized the English population. And he even suggests that the revolutions that happened in the 20th century in East Europe, Asia, Latin America, et cetera, were because those places were less colonized than the centers of empire in Europe and eventually the US. So curious if you have other thoughts on that kind of question about because I know you're always trying to think about what allows people to be courageous or not, right? And so what are the kind of the deeper traumas maybe for certain folks in being able to get around to stepping up and speaking about their conditions, acting about their conditions?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, though. And I think in order to even begin to answer your deep question, though, brother, we would have to have so much more historical analysis and historical knowledge and studies of these various contexts. Because one of the things that's humbling about any kind of Marxist analytical tradition is historical specificity means, and of course Gramsci and others have taught us this, that it's hard to even make claims about what you see, let alone what you're analyzing, without knowing a lot about the context of the people themselves. Now, for example, from my point of view, I would say, well, no matter how much the ruling class in Britain hated the cognate language of the working classes and so forth, when they got to the States and saw indigenous peoples or saw Africans, I think they hated us more. Now, I can't just say that. I'd have to have some historical evidence for that, right? But then we engage in an argument to see that. But each case is different. So Huey Newton's, his brilliance, that he trots out his hypothesis. But when my dear brother Cedric says, well, let's look at pre-modern racialism. For a lot of people say, there's no such thing. Race was created by the modern world. It's a result of the capitalist mode of production. You say, well, the institutionalized forms of racism certainly were facilitated by predatory capitalist processes and became thoroughly institutionalized. But there were racist images of black people going all the way back to the Greeks themselves. Frank Snowden's wonderful book on blacks in antiquity, Harvard dissertation, 1944. He taught at Howard for 40 years. He taught a sister named Toni Morrison. And he was one of these real kind of proper Negroes, you know what I mean? Stokely couldn't spend too much time in his class. But Tony's sitting right there on the front row, because he had his bow tie on and so forth and so on, and he spoke proper and so forth. Now Sterling Brown was around the corner singing the blues, but they're in the same place, Howard University. And his argument was there was no color prejudice of any substance in terms of being institutionalized, but there were certain images. Then Isaacs comes back, another scholar, and says, no, it was actually more institutionalized than Snowden thought. Well, see, that's historical inquiry. We need discussions about that. What does Herodotus say about the Egyptians? The Egyptians, like the Persians, they're up at the top of civilization. Interesting. But then, of course, people come along and say, what? Egypt's not really Africa. No, let's academically colonize them and make them part of an outpost of Western civilization. No, you can't do it. Not just because of the map. Ask the Egyptians themselves. We are Egyptians. Now, some of the Egyptians have internalized certain perceptions of sub-Saharan Africans, but they're still Africans. They are not Europeans. They are not Greeks, and so forth and so on. So you see how complicated this thing is. We had to be very, very humble and tenacious at the same time in moving in that direction. But there's no doubt under God's heaven that by the time you get to the early European periods and the takeoff of capitalist modes of production, the white supremacy is running out of control. It really is. It's a blessing to have you here. NYU's glad to have you too, though, brother.
Indeed, indeed. David, let me see. Yes, David?
Hello?
Oh, yeah, it works.
Hi, nice to meet you.
How you doing there, brother?
So I thought that your discussion at first was interesting in terms of the mediation of social problems, right? We use theory to do this. And to me, oh, apologies. And to me, I'm from Queens. I'm from Jackson Heights. Like, you know, I have a lot of friends. I grew up in like the New York City public school system.
Yeah.
I have a lot of Marxist friends that are like in Hunter, places like that. And I feel like one of the most fundamental difficulties has been the very problem itself of theory and of speaking academically. You know, different practices that I feel like alienate everyday working class people from what you would call a movement Marxism. So, you know, I thought that was like an interesting sort of debate for me. I began to notice like, you know, other distinctions, for example, of history, people's connection to history, why professors are always telling people to historicize as if people had no sort of like self-knowledge, in a way like Plato would say, like, you know, history, memory, self-knowledge. So I was very interested in your book, The Genealogy of Pragmatism, which is such a, you write really good. So
Wow, that's very kind, very kind.
It's a really great book. It's fascinating to me because I think that America truly has evaded philosophy. And I think that there are very historical reasons. I agree with your thesis that it's a problem of the frontier in a way, that we are creating ever new frontiers. We are a mythically innocent people. You know, all these things I think are translatable to material issues. And I come from the perspective, perhaps maybe not so romantic, you know, for me, you know, I've been against interpretation. I like to keep things very local. You know, when we have discussions, I always say, you know, social reform starts with your family, with people around you. So there's definitely a disconnect that I think pragmatism sort of embodies, this sort of middle ground. And what you note in that book is you talk about prophetic pragmatism, right? But, you know, it's interesting because it turns in a sort of non-theoretical turn. Like, to me, it feels like cultural criticism, and you talk about this too, right? And, you know, you make some interesting distinctions, especially with Roberto Unger and Jose Mariátegui, right? People that I'm very interested in. So, you know, like, I know you do a lot of cultural criticism. Sometimes it feels like politics is impossible. So I wonder, you know, how can we look to this sort of American background, our own heritage? Because I find sometimes that the academy is a little, somewhat too obsessive with, you know, French intellectualism and whatnot, and, you know, the problem of Foucault and, you know, things like that. So, yeah, I was wondering what sort of material barriers maybe have you encountered in your cultural criticism? I like your style as well. You know, I like that term, prophetic pragmatism. I think that it embodies and it's very smart about our sort of American epistemology. I think that preaching a little bit should not be, you know, looked down upon. So if you had any sort of like, you know, reaction to this, you know, I really appreciate it.
Ooh, I appreciate that question, though. Good God Almighty. We could really spend a whole lot of time on that. You know, the great Richard Hofstadter, who taught at this place, died in 1970, so young. He wrote that classic, Anti-Intellectualism in America, you remember? That's the most powerful text ever written, responding to your question, right here in the history department. What is the first thing he says? The Americans exalt intelligence and have deep fear of intellect. Because intelligence is a manipulative faculty tied to market strategy that gives evaluations, and intellect evaluates the evaluations. It interrogates the deeper assumptions and presuppositions. America is the most market-saturated empire in the history of the world. It's also the most religiously saturated in terms of dealing with the bombardment of that market, that haven in a heartless world that Christopher Lasch talked about. He was trained here under Henry Commanger. And you all know Christopher Lasch, The Culture of Narcissism, 1979. These are very important figures and voices in terms of wrestling with what we're trying to come to terms with, you see. So that when we talk about you know, intellect, what form does intellect take? See, if it takes poetic form, then a lot of the brothers and sisters and siblings you're hanging out with, oh, shoot. Man, shit, I teach in prisons for 57 years. We give close analyses of damn wretchedness and weakness of readings of mortal man in the last part of The Pimp a Butterfly. books of Job, problem of theodicy. There's a whole lot of intellectual activity going on, not just because he won this darn Pulitzer Prize. I ain't worried about no prize. He don't need no goddamn Pulitzer Prize to be appreciated for his intellectual genius. But it's in a form that a lot of people would hold at arm's length. Shoot, the brothers in the prison get into a reading of that. I got insights coming at me. You know what I mean? The dialogue with Tupac, and we can go on in this regard. How does that relate to tradition? How come Tupac is silent when he raised a question at the end? My God. That's like Percy Shelley's Triumph of Life. And the sentence never finishes. It just drops. Percy, what happened? Kendrick, how come Tupac goes blank? What's the question? How we young folk gonna make it, Tupac? Give us some advice. Well, that's heartbreaking, isn't it? Kendrick will break your heart. Kafka will too. Shakespeare will too. Dante will if you only get up to the Inferno. Another two books, a little different. See what I mean? It depends on what form the intellect takes. So when people say they're anti-intellectual, what is their conception of what intellect is and who the intellectuals are? That becomes a question. And we have had to be humble enough to be true to ourselves in terms of our trainings, but also be true to the people and want them to see just what you've seen so it might help them in their struggles. Generate some courage and hope in them as you're trying to generate the hope, and you learn from them as they learn from you. So in that sense, I would say that the distinctive features of the American empire culturally, philosophically, is what John Dewey said when he said, American thinkers tend to give metaphysical status to futurity. It's always in the future. No problem we cannot solve. No limits can hold us. No constraints can hold us. You hear it in presidential addresses every year. It's the green light at the end of Great Gatsby. Gatsby believed in the green light. Tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow will be great. No problem can hold us because tomorrow. Oh, so you're only concerned about results in a very crude, consequentialist, and utilitarian way. What about integrity? What about honesty? What about lost causes? What about those great figures who held up something grand and got crushed? Oh, they're not American heroes. No, they're not going to have no airport like John Wayne Airport. He's a conqueror. Unless they rewrite the script. Sometimes Clint Eastwood surprises us, right, as he gets older. But the point is, this obsession with future, control, manipulation, intelligence, STEM itself, and the fetishizing of STEM, as important and crucial as science and technology actually are, the fetishizing of STEM is an extension of that. So if you have no soul craft, and you have no character, and you have no courage, but you're a genius in STEM, you a dangerous mother, shut your mouth. You dangerous. Because you don't know what kind of morality and spirituality you have with your STEM genius. And I'm not just talking about, folk majoring in engineering at Columbia, but as a structural presence in a hyper capitalist culture and society that we live in, with its monopolies and oligopolies and so on. But don't get discouraged though with yourself or the others too. That's the crucial thing, no problem.
But I think this system we're going to have time for two more questions.
Shorty. You all been so kind. You've been so patient. We appreciate it.
This is maybe a question that's more about being a person in the world right now.
Yes.
Which is hard. But I was thinking what Bernard said earlier about cycles and limitations, and what I think I like most about, that I find most impressive and aspirational about Marx and Du Bois is how they kept changing their minds. Like they went from talented 10th to Black Reconstruction. And even at the end of his life, I think Du Bois was still saying things that he might have changed his mind on now, like being pro-Liberia. And I think something that I'm really afraid of is in academia, in the impossibility of being political and ideology, it's really hard in this world to change your mind. And when I look at counter-protesters and counter-revolutionaries, I'm like, how can you think that? But I also understand. And Marx changed his mind a lot too. And I guess I'm wondering, I think we talk a lot about what are the conditions for revolution, but like, what are the conditions in myself, or maybe that you think about in yourself, maybe spiritually even, of making sure that when it's time to change your mind towards something emancipatory, you can do that. I'm really afraid for myself that there will come a time that I don't do that. So I'm just thinking about that all the time, and I'm scared.
Ooh, no, I hear you. And that's a very, very poignant and profound question, because, I mean, courage is the enabling virtues for all the other virtues to function, you see. And courage is not recklessness or rashlessness, because there's an element of phronesis, practical wisdom. But fear is there, and you've got to work through that fear in a wise way. And courage is inseparable from fortitude. And fortitude is the fusion of courage with character. And then you can have a magnanimity of character, which is high level of courage and compassion. And at that level, you know, you're still fearful, but you're working through the fear. Now, Mary Ellen Pleasant, you know, the black woman who was the godmother of human rights in California, who gave John Brown $750,000 in 1857. That's millions of dollars translated for us. But she had married a robber baron. He dropped dead. She got his money. And she used to begin her speeches. She would say, "I'd rather be a corpse than a coward." I say, Mary Ellen, you're setting a high standard. I ain't scared of death, but I like to be moving. I'm not ready for the worms as of yet. But to be a coward, and Gandhi himself said what? He would rather have people engage in violence than be cowardly. That's what Gandhi said. He's read Ruskin, he's read Thoreau, he's read Tolstoy, and he read Shelley. He always invoked Shelley in his speeches. I got to make sure, see, this is my daughter. No, it's not her. Okay. So this sense of what goes into the making of courage, because we not fearful, but the fear is always there, meaning that fear is coming at us, but the fear will not have the last word. You see, be not afraid. Wow, you see all that Quran, Hebrew scripture, New Testament, secular wisdom writings, be not afraid, because they know fear is the one thing that makes us much more conformist, cowardly, and so forth. But it's a matter of degrees and gradations, because it's always there. So I don't think you're going to have too much to worry about, because you're raising that question in such a courageous way. That's courage right there. That's courage right there. Absolutely. Indeed, indeed, indeed.
Sorry, I just was very excited by that response to Uzma's question. So my question is kind of going back to Du Bois a bit, because he touched on something in Dark Waters in White Souls that I think is still relevant today, and if I may indulge in my work specifically, because I work on French Algeria and counterinsurgency as being encoded into the very DNA of French government and administration, and the kind of blurring of boundaries between wartime and peacetime, and interior and exterior in the period of decolonization, but arguably still today. And so Du Bois says that America posits herself as a natural peacemaker, but there is no nation more ill-fitted for this role, and that America has marched proudly in the van of hatred, and also Europe and all of the aberrations that Europe commits in empire. These are not aberrations, but rather this is Europe, and this is not the ineffable heights from which it boasts. And so what I think I've looked at in these two specific quotes is that there is this positioning and this posturing, this absurd, it's almost delusional, the level of mental gymnastics and cognitive dissonance to be able to hold these two things to be true at the same time, to be able to commit this kind of level of violence, structural violence and other, baked into the very administration of a country. I'm talking about France. I'm not speaking about the United States because I don't know as much about it. But then,
we United States have
as much. But I myself, I'm looking at the French context. But then, how? I'm really struggling with how this is possible. I'm really struggling with explaining this paradox, and it comes down to ideas of citizenship and identity and racialization of identity, racialization of religion, of Islam, and creating this kind of second category citizen. And I think the United States has done this very successfully with its racial structures, but in France it's also a question of social apartheid and banlieues and creating spaces for other people. So I'm confused at this mental gymnastics and at the level of delusion, and I want to know what you think makes this thinkable and possible, because even today the state beams this discourse, the French state is beaming a discourse that it is, this nation of human rights and etc. And it's like, hello, you guys taught people how to torture, like that's how. So I'm confused by that, and I would love to pick your brain about that if I may. And thank you as well for your
Thank
inspiration.
you for that question too. Well, I tell you, we got every time I come to these discussions with Brother Bernard, I end up wrestling with these very, very deep questions, and I appreciate it. And we salute our dear brother Ben Schaefer too. We love that brother, mutual friend. I don't have an answer to that question. I can tell you this though, that somebody I find useful. His name is Ernst Becker. He wrote 2 books. One was called Escape from Evil, and another was called The Denial of Death. And what he was trying to come to terms with is, how could any regime, or how could any human soul live simultaneously in the midst of such overwhelming barbarism, atrocious criminal activity, and still hold on to some of the grandest ideals that one could imagine. Each person made in the image and likeness of a loving God, and therefore have a sanctity and dignity that no system could ever deny. That's Judaic discourse. That's Christian discourse. That has been one of the elements that's gone hand in hand with some of the most barbaric treatments across the board. And we could say the same thing about Brahmin superiority in India vis-a-vis our Dalit brothers and sisters. We go on and on. The Roma with Egypt, working class women and so forth. And Ernst Becker, he pulls from Marx, he pulls from Freud, he pulls from Klein, Melanie, he pulls from a number of psychologists. And he's an anthropologist too, very much like Cedric. That's very important. Because I mean, if there is an imperial discipline in the modern world, it's anthropology, right? Because they're studying folk outside of the West, and therefore they can contest the Western stereotypes, but that's the subject matter. I remember Brother Skip Gates told me, and Anthony Appiah too, when they were in Cambridge, the first 2 folk to get PhDs in Cambridge since the great Alexander Crummell, who was Du Bois's hero, another proper brother like Frank Snowden, though, that they went to see Soyinka, Wole Soyinka, towering literary artist, genius of plays and so forth. Well, they had put him in the anthropology department, you see, because they didn't think there was such a thing as African literature, you see. So that you can see the imperial discourse even subsuming someone of such overwhelming stature. Now, he went on to win a Nobel Prize. He was there with Tony and us, with Toni Morrison, when we were there in 1993. He won it in 87. Meaning what? That's the level of sedimentation, of inscription of the kind of barbarism you're talking about within the very heads of liberty, fraternity, and equality. My God, How you gonna juxtapose that? Same is true with the picture of this brother's office. Anybody remember the picture in Brother Bernard's office? Y'all remember that picture with the guillotine? The same ideals. People's heads are rolling. Robespierre sitting there looking at it. Didn't even know, just a few years later, his head gonna roll too. And he was against the death penalty up until they started. What goes into the struggle on the battlefield of human souls, of nation states, of economies? We are a wretched species. And yet we still so wonderful. I don't think there's any way of fully accounting for that. But the historical evidence is such that it's there. You know what I mean? So we have to be honest, and then most importantly recognize it's on the battlefield of our own souls. We're going to have the courage, the character, the fortitude to wrestle with it every day. Every day. Definitely. God bless you all, baby. God bless you. God bless you.
Professor Cornel West, you have blessed us with your brilliance and with your heart, with your brilliant mind and your expansive heart in such an inspiring way. I don't know how to thank you. Thank you again. Thank you again. Thank you again from all of us. I really feel that we've had an extraordinary session, an absolutely extraordinary session. And we'll bring it to a close now. I also want to thank Ricardo for all the organization. And Reno in the back for all the AV work. And all of you for all your brilliance as well. Thank you so much. I wish you all a productive and restful and also productive break, which you all get now, spring break. The next time we meet will be actually on a Tuesday rather than on a Wednesday. It's Tuesday, April 8th, and we'll be here with Kohei Saito, and we'll be discussing his work on late Marxism and degrowth communism, particularly in relationship with his new book called Slow Down, the Degrowth Manifesto. All right, so come on back, and once again, thank you so much, Cornel West, for joining us.
Thank you. Role model. Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right, please join us. Please join us for a quick drink with Cornell at the Arts and Crafts. Okay? Is everybody here? Quick drink. There's a quick drink at the Arts and Crafts. Okay? Thanks so much for coming.